All right. Feel free to let me know if ever my connection is bad. I appreciate that. Thanks, guys. We have an extender and then an internet, so I always try to be connected to my extender instead. Okay, so here we are in the integumentary system. It consists of your skin and all accessory structures. No, I didn't say anything important, Joanna. All I said was that your body has 11 body systems, and we're going to start going over those body systems in lecture. So up until this point, I've talked a lot about cells. We've talked about tissues. We've talked about chemistry. And now for the next probably month or two of class, we're going to be going over body systems. So we start with the integumentary system. And this lecture goes hand in hand well with what you'll be going over in lab this week. Integument literally means covering. So in your integumentary system consists everything that covers. So your skin, your hair, your nails, and we also include glands in this. The appearance of your integumentary system can indicate physiological imbalances in the body. And what that means is if someone comes to your emergency room, the first thing that medical professionals will look at that patient is they'll look at the color of their skin, because the color of their skin can indicate something that could be medically wrong with them. If they are blue, maybe they don't have oxygen going to the surface of their skin. If they're ashen or gray, they could be going through shock. If they're very red, they could be maybe suffering heat stroke or have a very high fever. So the integumentary system, the skin, is kind of the first thing that medical professionals will look at when someone comes into the ER. Clammy as well, yes, along with kind of the shock. So here are the layers of the integumentary system. If you guys have had lab already, this will look a little bit familiar. And if you're having lab today, this is a great basis for what you'll be doing in lab. So these layers in the integumentary system, or the skin, if we start at this most superficial layer, this is called the epidermis layer. And the epidermis layer contains the skin cells at the surface of the skin. These skin cells can be dead, where they're filled with keratin, which is like a protein that provides a protective covering to your skin, as well as prevents against body loss. Or these cells at the surface of the skin cannot be filled with keratin. They're called non-keratinized, and they will be more moist, they'll be alive. So you'll find those kind of surface skin cells in areas of the body, like the mouth, the vagina, the anus. So that's the epidermis layer. We divide the epidermis layer into 5 strata, or 5 layers, which we'll go over in a little bit. And then the dermis is the layer below the epidermis. So you'll notice in the epidermis layer, there's no blood vessels. You might see some nerve endings, which you can't really tell in this picture, but in the epidermis, you have no blood vessels. And the way kind of the blood gets into that layer is kind of through these little offshoots of these arteries and veins where my cursor is. They kind of travel up in these little bumps that kind of reach into the epidermis from the dermis layer. But the dermis layer is where kind of everything else is. You'll see glands in the dermis layer. Sebaceous glands are attached to hairs. You'll see erector pili, smooth muscles, also attached to bases of hairs. Those help your hairs stand up on end when you have goosebumps. You'll see lots of different nerve endings. You'll see sweat glands that have more of a watery secretion that will release their substances to the surface of the skin. And so the skin, what makes up the skin is the epidermis and the dermis layer. Below the dermis layer is what we call the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis. And the hypodermis is not technically a part of the integumentary system, but we still include it on a lot of pictures or models of the integumentary system because it kind of gives you a little more background. Well, what then comes under the dermis? We have this layer of adipose tissue or fat. So those are kind of the layers of the integumentary system, which you should be very familiar with. Integumentary system functions, it works to protect. So your skin is kind of your body's first line of defense against abrasion. You know, if you run into a wall or if someone hits you, your skin is the first line of defense to protect all the underlying organs and tissues below it, as well as ultraviolet light. So your skin has cells in it called melanocytes. And when light touches your skin, these melanocytes produce melanin to to try to protect your skin from those UV light rays. Melanin turns your skin darker colored. So that's where the skin tan comes in. Another function, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, a sensation function of your integumentary system. You have lots of sensory receptors in your skin that can detect heat, cold, touch, pressure, and pain. Vitamin D production, when your skin is exposed to UV light, the skin can produce a molecule that will later be transformed into vitamin D, which is very important for a lot of processes in the body. Temperature regulation. This is a big one. The amount of blood flow beneath the surface of your skin and the activity of sweat glands in the skin both help to regulate body temperature. So when you get really hot, those sweat glands will produce sweat to try to release some of the heat in that sweat, so to try to dissipate the heat to cool you down. And as well, when you get hot, the blood vessels will dilate to try to kind of spread out the blood to try to cool you down. Excretion, very, very tiny, small amounts of waste products are lost through your skin through gland secretion. So whether that's through a sweat, kind of sweaty secretion, or whether it's through sebaceous gland secretion. And sebaceous glands secrete more of an oily substance to help your hairs to not dry out. But a little bit of waste is released through the skin via those gland secretions. So what I mentioned before is we have our skin is a part of your integumentary system, and your skin is made up of two major tissue layers. We have the epidermis, which is the superficial layer. It is the layer of epithelial tissue that rests on top of the dermis. So the epidermis will either be stratified squamous epithelium, and it'll be keratinized if it has dead superficial cell layers that have the keratin in them. And that's what covers the majority of your skin, or it will be non-keratinized stratified squamous if the superficial cells are moist and alive. What type of waste, Cameron? Good question. So your skin, so your sweat has a lot of kind of sodium chloride salt in it. So some of the waste might be excess sodium chloride ions. So any sort of waste, if you have too much sodium chloride, that's usually what your skin secretes. And you'll notice that when if you ever are starting to sweat and you have sweat dripping into your mouth, your sweat tastes kind of salty because it's made up of sodium and chloride ions, as well as a lot of water. But those are the two ions in it, sodium chloride, that give your sweat a salty taste to it. And then the dermis is the layer below your epidermis that's made up of dense connective tissue. And the dermis is where we'll see a lot of the sweat glands, the nerve endings, the blood vessels, the erector pili muscles. We'll go over what is all in the dermis. Then the skin rests on the subcutaneous tissue, which is a layer of connective tissue. It's not a part of the skin, but this subcutaneous tissue, also called the hypodermis, is made up of adipose tissue or fat. Can you sweat out alcohol? I would have to look into more of that. I think, drinking, maybe could cause you to sweat. Sweating out alcohol, I'm not totally sure. Let me think about that. Maybe some of the breakdown products of alcohol. That's a good question, Yolanda. Maybe one of your classmates is Googling it right now and can help you. That's a good question. Let me make a note and look into that, okay? About what other waste products that you can sweat out. That would be helpful after drinking a lot. Go work out. You'll feel better. Yeah, that's a good question. All right. Just letting a couple other people in. So here we have these epidermis and dermis layers. Again, the epidermis is the most superficial layer made up of that stratified squamous epithelium. And then the dermis layer is below the epidermis. And these dermal papilla are these little bumps. So the epidermis and the dermis kind of interlock with each other because these dermal papilla kind of reach up into the epidermis. The function of the dermal papilla is, if you look closely, you'll see different nerve endings and different blood vessels kind of reaching up into them so that the epidermis has some blood supply. So that's the function of the dermal papilla. You guys are probably too young for this, but remember those kind of egg carton mattresses? I don't know if any of you know what I'm talking about, but that's kind of what these dermal papilla look like. They're bumps that have these kind of egg carton-shaped bumps to them. And what they do is they cause kind of an interlocking pattern between the epidermis and the dermal papilla to provide blood supply to the epidermis above the dermis. The below picture shows some of the strata of the epidermis. Remember I said there's 5 strata or layers to the epidermis, and a few are labeled here, and we'll go over those in a little bit. You still have one, Matt. Wow, do they still make those? I feel like I have childhood memories of sleeping on them, like during sleepovers or when we'd have people over, we'd have the egg carton mattresses. All right, the epidermis prevents water loss and resists abrasion. And that's mainly because of the keratinized stratified squamous that are on the most superficial layer. So the keratin-filled dead cells on the most superficial layer provide a lot of protection against water loss as well as abrasion. And the epidermis is composed of distinct layers called strata. And we'll go over these strata now. The stratum corneum is the most superficial stratum of the epidermis. It consists of these dead squamous cells filled with keratin. The keratin is what gives the stratum corneum its structural strength. And cells of the deepest strata or the deepest layer of the epidermis perform mitosis. I forgot to lock my door. The deepest strata perform mitosis, and what they'll do as new cells are formed, they push the older cells to the surface where they will slough off or flake off. And again, a lot of what we're breathing are these dead skin cells that have been sloughed off from our skin. Excessive sloughing, which I'm sure we might have experience with this, of the stratum corneum cells from the surface of the scalp is called dandruff. So if excessive cells are being sloughed off, that's what causes dandruff. And if skin is subjected to a lot of friction, the number of layers in the stratum corneum can greatly increase, producing a thickened area called a callus. So I'm thinking of guitar players. They have a lot of friction between their fingers and the strings. So a lot of guitar players will form calluses on their fingers. And from what I remember, you kind of want to form calluses because it helps with the pain of touching the guitar strings. I took like 3 lessons in 8th grade. That's all my experience with guitars. But that is what a callus is. It's a thickened area of the stratum corneum due to excessive or when the skin is subjected to a lot of friction. If over a bony prominence, so if a bone is kind of sticking out at a strange angle, the stratum corneum can thicken to form a cone-shaped structure called a corn. And this can often be caused or common on the feet if kind of if you wear too narrow of shoes and your big toe is kind of bent inward, that bony prominence where it's bending can form kind of a corn on the end. The dermis then is composed of dense collagenous connective tissue containing a lot of different things. There can be fibroblasts, adipocytes, which are fat cells, and macrophages. Nerves, hair follicles, smooth muscles, glands, and lymphatic vessels will extend into the dermis layer, and collagen fibers, which are oriented in many different directions, and elastic fibers are responsible for the structural strength of the dermis and resistance to stretch. So you'll notice, if you pull your hand out and you kind of pull up your skin a little bit, it'll snap back into place because of that kind of structural strength of the dermis. Some collagen fibers are oriented in more directions than others in the dermis, and these form what we call lines of cleavage or cleavage lines. They're also known as tension lines in the skin, and they're more resistant to stretch. And these cleavage lines, I'll show you a picture of this in a second. So these cleavage lines are just when layers of collagen kind of are formed in a more general direction in the dermis. And this is really important to know how these lines of cleavage kind of are arranged in the skin. For those of you who might become surgeons or surgical techs, if you make an incision parallel with these lines, it tends to gap less and produce less scar tissue when healing. And if the skin is overstretched for any reason, the dermis can be damaged, leaving stretch marks. So a lot of times you hear pregnant women getting stretch marks because the skin is being stretched to accommodate for the large increase in size of the belly, or some overweight people there, if they lose a lot of weight, they might still see the stretch marks there, because that stretch marks are caused from the dermis being damaged because it's being stretched a little too much. So this is what lines of cleavage look like. So what this picture is showing is kind of the bundles of these collagen fibers and how they're arranged throughout the body. And the picture below here, kind of where my laser is, this is showing an incision kind of parallel with the lines of cleavage. And if the incision is made parallel, when it's healing, it'll gap less. It'll be able to come back together because the collagen fiber bundles are arranged in that same pattern. However, if we make an incision kind of perpendicular to those lines of cleavage, it's going to gap more because the parallel bundles of collagen are used to going in a certain direction. So it'll kind of pull that incision away, and it'll just take longer for it to heal. So good surgeons will know these lines of cleavage and make incisions among these lines, unless it's an emergency situation and they just need to get in there right away. The dermal papilla then are those projections toward the epidermis found in the upper part of the dermis. The dermal papilla contain many blood vessels, and the dermal papilla in the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, and the tips of the digits are arranged in parallel curving ridges that shape the overlying epidermis into fingerprints or footprints. And we all have different fingerprints or footprints, which is why we get fingerprinted for, when you're getting a job, because we all have unique sets of fingerprints. And that is due to the dermal papilla making these ridges that come through the epidermis. So now skin color. Factors that determine our skin color include different pigments in the skin, as well as blood circulating through the skin. If you get embarrassed or shy, your skin gets red because your blood vessels are dilating, which are bringing that more blood to the surface of the skin, as well as this thickness of the stratum corneum. Remember, the stratum corneum is the most superficial layer, and the thickness of that layer can also kind of play a role in the skin color. The two primary pigments that attest to skin color are melanin and keratin. And melanin is the group of pigments primarily responsible for skin, hair, and eye color. And keratin is a yellow pigment found in the skin. It's also found in plants such as squash and carrots. Most of your melanin molecules are brown to black pigments, but some are yellowish or reddish. What melanin will do is it provides protection against UV light from the sun. Melanin is produced by melanocytes. Whenever you see the suffix "cyte," that has to do with a cell. So these are cells that produce melanin. The melanin is packaged into vesicles called melanosomes, which move into the cell processes of melanocytes. And epithelial cells will phagocytize or kind of break off the tips of the melanocytes, thereby acquiring these melanosomes. So here's just a look at how melanin is transferred to epithelial cells. I don't think you guys have any test questions about these specifics, but just showing how melanosomes are produced. They move into the melanocyte cell processes. Epithelial cells kind of break off the tips, and that's how the melanocytes then get transferred to the epithelial cells and then are inside of them. Now we'll kind of talk about skin color. So skin color, if you have a large amount of melanin, this will form freckles or moles in some regions of the skin. So this is why, some people who are very fair skin, when they go out into the sunshine, their freckles might appear because due to UV light rays, that's producing more melanin as a protective feature. So their freckles might come out more. I have a redheaded daughter and she's very fair skinned. My husband and I don't have red hair, but she does. It's a whole nother story about recessive traits, but she gets all these freckles that come out. You also could see this in your moles. So if any of you have moles or freckles throughout the body, that's just where you have a large amount of melanin present. Melanin production is determined by genetic factors, exposure to light, and hormones. So hormones could cause greater or less melanin production. Genetic factors, if your parents had a lot of moles or freckles, you might get more moles or freckles, or exposure to light could bring out freckles. Genetic factors are also responsible for the amounts of melanin produced in different races. Since all races have about the same number of melanocytes, the racial variations in skin color are more determined by the amount, the kind, and the distribution of melanin. So we all have about the same number of melanocytes, but the differences in skin color are more determined by the specific type of melanocytes and just how melanin is distributed throughout the skin. Exposure to UV light, for example, stimulates melanocytes to increase melanin production as a protective mechanism, and this results in a sun tan. And although many genes are responsible for skin color, one single mutation, which means a single mutation in the DNA, like an adenine for a guanine, can prevent the production of melanin. And that's what causes albinism. Usually someone is incredibly white, fair skinned. They're even very white in the color of their eyes as well. And that is what albinism is. So a single mutation that prevents the production of melanin. Keratin then is one of the other pigments found in the skin. It's lipid soluble, meaning it can be dissolved in fat. When it's consumed, it accumulates in the lipids of the stratum corneum and in the adipocytes of the dermis and subcutaneous tissue. So if large amounts of keratin are consumed, the skin can become quite yellowish. And there's all these stories about babies' noses turning orange if you feed them too many carrots. I don't know, you can have an experiment with your kids later and try to feed them a lot of carrots and see if their skin changes color. The color of blood in the dermis also contributes to skin color. And this is how we get into some of the diagnostic measures used when looking at the color of someone's skin. A decrease in blood flow, for example, which could occur in shock, can make the skin appear very pale or ashen or gray. A decrease in blood oxygen levels can produce a bluish tint of the skin, and that's called cyanosis. There might be a lecture question about cyanosis or what the skin would look like in shock, so just keep those in mind as well. Subcutaneous tissue then, so the skin, called the cutaneous membrane, rests on the subcutaneous tissue. This subcutaneous tissue, which is not a part of the skin, is called the hypodermis. And the subcutaneous tissue attaches the skin to the underlying bone and muscle and also supplies it with blood vessels and nerves. It's a loose connective tissue. It includes adipose tissue that contains about half of your body's stored lipids. So half of your fat will be in the subcutaneous layer, again, to help as a protective mechanism and as well as to help padding and insulation to anything below the surface of the skin. The amount, location of adipose tissue can vary with your age, your sex, your diet, as we know, but also your age and sex. So babies have a lot, little kids, they're so active, they don't have much. And then as you get older, we maybe tend to gain a little bit more subcutaneous tissue. The subcutaneous tissue can be used also to estimate your total body fat. And there's an acceptable percentage of body fat, and it varies from 21 to 30% for females, from 13 to 25% for males. So females on average will have more of this subcutaneous tissue naturally in their bodies too. Okay, so we talked about skin, and now we'll talk about hair and nails, because again, we're in the integumentary system, which means covering. So we need to get through anything that covers the surface of the skin. So moving on to hair. In humans, hair is found everywhere on the skin, except on the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, the lips, the nipples, parts of your genitalia, and the distal segments of your fingers and toes. And each hair will rise from a hair follicle, which is an invagination of the epidermis that extends deep into the dermis. A hair shaft describes the part of this hair that protrudes above the surface of the skin, and the root is below the surface of the skin, and that's where the hair bulb will be, and that's just the expanded base of the root. The hair itself has a hard cortex layer, which surrounds a softer inner medulla. We're going to see that these words cortex and medulla often in anatomy. And cortex will always kind of be the outer layer and the medulla will be the inner layer. The cortex is covered by the cuticle, which is a single layer of overlapping cells that holds the hair in the hair follicle. Hair is produced in the hair bulb, which will rest on the hair papilla. And the hair papilla is just an extension of the dermis that protrudes into the hair bulb and contains blood vessels. Hair is produced in cycles with a growth stage and a resting stage. During the growth stage, hair is formed by actively dividing epithelial cells called mitosis. Within the hair bulb, these cells divide and undergo keratinization. During the resting stage, growth will stop and the hair is held in the hair follicle. And when the next growth stage begins, a new hair is formed and the old hair falls out. The duration of each stage between growth and resting of your hair will depend on the individual hair. Your eyelashes, for example, they grow for about 30 days and they rest for 105 days, whereas your hair on the scalp will grow for 3 years and rest for 1 to 2 years. So very interesting. The loss of hair normally means that the hair is being replaced because the old hair falls out of the hair follicle when the new hair begins to grow. Loss of hair can be due to age, hormonal features. If you're pregnant, you don't lose any hair. And then when you give birth, you lose it all and you almost become bald. So that can be due to a variety of different reasonings as well. Your hair color is determined by melanin. So the amounts of melanin, the type of melanin will determine your hair color. With your age, the amount of melanin in the hair will decrease. And that's what causes your hair color to become faded. And if your hair then contains no melanin, it can turn white. Each hair follicle is attached to smooth muscle cells called erector pili muscles. And you'll have some test question about this type of muscle. This is the only type of muscle that's found in the dermis layer of the skin. And what this muscle does is it will contract to cause the hair to become perpendicular to the skin surface to cause your hair to stand up in terms of goosebumps. So here we finally show you a picture of all these structures that we've just talked about. We'll kind of talk with the hair. The hair shaft is again what is above the surface of the skin. The hair itself is made up of the medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle. And the hair root is what we described below the surface of the skin. Here we have the hair bulb. It's the base of the hair root. And the hair papilla is the area within the hair bulb that contains those actively dividing cells. You'll see the erector pili muscle attached to the base of the hair follicle wall, as well as a sebaceous gland, which is what we will get to. The sebaceous glands will always be associated with hairs because they will be producing this oily substance that keeps your hairs from drying out. So then glands. The major glands in the skin, you just have 2 of them. You have sebaceous and sweat glands. Sebaceous glands are a simple branched acinar gland. I think someone in my lab had a question about what type of gland a sebaceous gland is. So it's a simple, but it's branched, with most of it being connected by a duct to the superficial part of the hair follicle. So keep that in mind. Sebaceous glands are always attached to the hair follicle. They will produce sebum, which is an oily white substance rich in lipids. The sebum is released by what we call the holocrine secretion. It will lubricate the hair as well as the surface of the skin to help prevent drying out. That's a great question. Instead of dyeing your hair, could you just take a lot of melanin? You know, if you would take melanin as a pill, I don't know if there's scientific advances yet that that melanin would go directly to your hair. That melanin could go to your skin. I have not heard of people taking melanin to avoid gray hairs. Don't try it, George says. Do you have any experience with that, George? I haven't heard of it either, but it doesn't sound very like a good idea. But good question, Andrew. It does make sense. So I understand your reasoning, and that does make a lot of sense. Melanin as a supplement. Not sure about that. Nope, that's a great question. All right, so I think we talked about sebaceous glands producing the oil sebum associated with the hair. And then there's two types of sweat glands also found in the skin. Good question too, Ryan. I don't know if it would be permanent. Yeah. We have eccrine and apocrine. Eccrine sweat glands are simple coiled tubular glands. They release sweat by americrine secretion. Eccrine glands are located almost in every part of the skin, but they're most numerous on the palms and the soles, and they produce a secretion that's mostly water with very few salts. Eccrine sweat glands have ducts that open onto the surface of the skin through sweat pores and are there for thermal regulation. So when you get very hot, they will release sweat to try to dissipate or spread out the heat that's being released in the water droplets of sweat. Sweat can also be released in the palms, soles, armpits, and other places because of emotional stress. So if you're really nervous, if you're in an interview, your hands will get clammy. You'll start to sweat in your armpits because due to emotional stress, you will also release sweat. Apocrine sweat glands are the second type of sweat gland in the skin. They're simple coiled tubular glands. And the apocrine sweat glands, what makes them different is they are a little bit richer in organic substances. So these ones will be the smelly ones. It's generally odorless, but it could turn smelly. These glands will open into the hair follicles in the armpits, genitalia. They'll become active at puberty. So usually during puberty, you might start to be using deodorant. Some people don't use deodorant and they say that's better. Anyway, that's a whole nother topic. Yeah. The secretion from apocrine sweat glands is generally odorous, but when it is released, it quickly breaks down by bacterial action. And that's what gives the body an odor from sweating. It's not the secretion itself, but when it releases, then it gets broken down by bacteria, and then it gives it an odor. So here we have glands of the skin, the eccrine and apocrine sweat glands. The eccrine sweat glands, you'll see they are more of the watery secretion. They'll release their substances to the surface of the skin. The apocrine sweat glands are more of the kind of lipid secretion. They'll release it to the surface of the skin. It's shown here next to a hair. I don't want you to get it confused with the sebaceous glands because the sebaceous glands will always be associated with the hair, but the apocrine sweat glands, they're showing it next to the hair because you'll find the apocrine sweat glands in your armpits, genitalia, where there might be hair on the body. You'll see the sweat pores where the ducts of the eccrine sweat glands will be released as well. And then the sebaceous glands will always be associated with the hair follicle itself. So then we go into nails. So we're kind of getting through here. Integumentary system, we talked about skin, we talked about hair. We'll talk about nails. The nail is a very thin plate consisting of layers of dead stratum corneum cells. So again, the stratum corneum is the most superficial layer of the epidermis, and the nails just consist of layers of that dead stratum corneum. They contain a very hard type of keratin. The visible part of the nail is the nail body, and the part of the nail covered by the skin is the nail root. The cuticle, also known as the eponychium, is stratum corneum that extends onto the nail body, and the nail root extends distally from the nail matrix. The nail attaches to the underlying nail bed, which is located distal to the nail matrix. The nail matrix and the bed, and I'll show you a picture of this. These are epithelial cells with the stratum basale layer, which is the deepest layer of the epidermis that will give rise to the cells that form the nail. So basically, the nail matrix is where new nail cells will form. A small part of the nail matrix called the lunula can be seen through the nail body. And if you look at your nails now, this is what is the whitish crescent or moon-shaped area at the base of the nail. That's the lunula. And cell production within the nail matrix will cause the nail to grow continuously. So here's a look at the nail. I'll put on my laser. Here's the lunula, the part of the nail matrix that can be seen. The cuticle, the nail root with the nail body is what is being exposed, and then the free edge. If we look at a sagittal view of the nail, so if we cut it in half, we can kind of see where the nail root would be underneath the skin. And again, the nail matrix, I'm just going to circle it. This is where kind of actively dividing nail cells are being formed. and then they will push the nail cells out into the nail body, the free edge, which is what you will snip every week, every other week. And you can see here where the epidermis will lie. Remember that epidermis, the stratum corneum, is what makes up the nail body, and the stratum basale layer of the epidermis, which is what will make up the nail matrix. And you can see where the bone of your fingers will be located. Integumentary system performs many protective functions, which we talked a little bit about. It helps to reduce body water loss, and that's just because our bodies are filled with a very high percentage of water, but you're not leaking out water all the time because your skin is helping to protect against water loss. Also, when you dive into a pool, your body doesn't take in all the water that you're kind of going under. It also acts as a barrier that prevents microorganisms and other foreign substances from entering the body. Some microorganisms and foreign substances will enter the body if you get cut. So if your skin gets cut, whether due to a knife, a splinter, any other sort of damage to the skin, that could be a way that microorganisms could get in. And that's why when you get cut, you have to be worried about an infection, because normally the skin keeps out all of those microorganisms. Your skin protects underlying structures against abrasion, and melanin will absorb that UV light and protects underlying structures from damaging effects. Hair protection: the hair on your head acts as a heat insulator. The eyebrows keep sweat out of your eyes. Your eyelashes protect your eyes from foreign objects. And the hair in your nose and your ears is also helpful. Not always the prettiest if it's sticking out, but the hair in your nose and ears prevents the entry of dust and other materials into the inner ear, as well as into the respiratory tract. Your nails protect the ends of your fingers and toes from damage, and your nails can also be used in self-defense. So sensory receptors in the skin. So we talked about how your skin can sense touch, cold, vibration, heat. So you have many different types of sensory receptors located within the skin. They can detect all these different types of stimuli: pain, heat, cold, pressure. And although your hair does not have a nerve supply, sensory receptors around the hair follicle can also detect when your hair is moving. Vitamin D production: UV light causes the skin to produce a precursor molecule of vitamin D. This precursor molecule, which will be caused when you're out in the sun, will then be carried by your blood to the liver, where it's converted enzymatically. So with an enzyme, it'll be changed and then carried by the blood to the kidneys, where it's converted to the active form of vitamin D. And vitamin D is important because it stimulates your small intestine to absorb calcium and phosphate for so many different body functions. So this is why, in Southern California, we don't have a problem with getting enough sun, but places in the Midwest, or kind of in the northern regions of the US, for people who are inside their homes for 6 months out of the year during winter, without this vitamin D production, it could directly affect the way their body is able to absorb calcium and phosphate. So that's another function of the skin, is helping to produce vitamin D. And again, I just like to highlight, vitamin D is important because it helps to stimulate the absorption of calcium and phosphate. Calcium and phosphate are used for a lot of different reasons, which we'll talk about when we get to muscle contraction, in other processes, other physiological processes. But vitamin D is what tells your intestine to take in excess calcium and phosphate. Temperature regulation of body temperature is important because the rate of chemical reactions within your body can be increased or decreased by changes in body temperature. So your body is constantly trying to maintain a homeostasis body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, because if we increase or decrease that, that will affect chemical reactions and processes in the body. A slight change in temperature can make enzymes operate less efficiently, disrupt normal rates of chemical changes. Exercise, fever, and an increase in environmental temperature tend to raise body temperature. And in order to maintain homeostasis, the body will rid itself of excess heat due to fever, exercise, 100 degrees in Southern California. What blood vessels will do is they will dilate and enable more blood flow within the skin, and this causes the heat to dissipate or spread throughout the body. And whenever you spread something out, it'll dissipate or spread out the heat to try to cool it down. Sweat will also assist in loss of heat through evaporative cooling, because getting rid of this heat, the heat will be released through the water droplets in sweat as well. If body temperature begins to drop below normal, heat can be conserved by constricting blood vessels in the dermis. So when blood vessels are constrict, that means blood flow is not going through them as much, and that this will reduce blood flow to the skin. And what that will do is less heat will be transferred from deeper structures to the skin, and less heat loss will occur. So you're kind of keeping your blood in the deeper parts of the body. The big thing too, especially if you're thinking of hypothermia, is you're trying to conserve all the blood around your vital organs. So these blood vessels will constrict to try to maintain blood in the center part of the body. So you'll see people, in hypothermia or who are outside, the tips of their fingers might start to turn blue or black. Some people might lose their fingers or toes if they've been out in the cold too long. And that's because their body is trying to conserve heat, and it's not allowing blood to flow to their extremities, their toes. Yep, so this is where maintaining the set point in homeostasis. So the set point of temperature, so if we're talking about the variable temperature for homeostasis, because remember your body has a lot of different variables, temperature, pH, heart rate, but in terms of temperature, the set point is 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. There's kind of a normal range of values where body function can still occur. And then, so your body tries to maintain that set point by sweating or constricting blood vessels. So yes, you're right, Matt. So here's heat exchange in the skin. Blood vessels will dilation results in increased blood flow to the surface of the skin, which will result in heat loss. When blood vessels constrict, this results in decreased blood flow to the surface of the skin, which means heat loss across the epidermis decreases and the heat kind of stays more in the deeper regions of the body or around your vital organs. Excretion then has to do with excretion of waste products. Maybe this will answer our question a little bit about what waste products are excreted. Your integumentary system plays a very minor role in excretion, because most of the excretion of waste products occurs with your kidneys and urine, or with the digestive system in your feces. In addition to water and salts that are being secreted in sweat, sweat can also contain other waste products like urea, uric acid, and ammonia. And uric acid and ammonia are all kind of breakdown products of either proteins or amino acids. Anything that your body needs to get rid of will kind of break it down into urea, uric acid, or ammonia, and those can also be excreted via sweat. Even though the body can lose large amounts of sweat, the sweat glands do not play a significant role in the excretion of waste products, because again, most of your waste products are excreted with the urinary system via your kidneys or via your feces. So I think we have about 10 slides left. The diagnostic aid to your integumentary system, very useful. I mean, if you guys are going to be an EMT, any sort of technician, I mean, the first thing that you'll probably be taught is to look at your patient or the person who's lying on the ground when you get to the scene of an accident is just their skin color, because it can tell you really easily what's going on. So cyanosis is a bluish color to the skin. It's caused by decreased blood oxygen content. It's an indication of impaired circulatory or respiratory function. Yellowish skin color is called jaundice, sometimes seen in newborn babies. This can occur when the liver is damaged by a disease like viral hepatitis. A little kind of play on words here. So the suffix titus always means inflammation, and the prefix hepa always has to do with your liver. So this is some sort of inflammation of the liver due to a viral infection could cause jaundice. And that's because your liver is where the breakdown of bile occurs, or the creation of bile. And if it doesn't do that correctly, it could cause a yellow skin tone, which is jaundice. Rashes and lesions or cuts or damage to the skin can also be symptoms a problem somewhere else in the body. So if you guys are developing a rash of hives that are breaking out in a part of the body, it could be significant of what is going on below the body surface, or a rash could be indicative of something else that's going on with the body, hormonal change, stress. I think I once broke out in hives just to like extreme stress and exhaustion, which was not fun. So again, your skin can provide a diagnostic tool that's indicative of something else that's wrong with the body. We do talk a lot about burns. Yeah, so sweating could play a role in dehydration because, that's why you have to be really careful when you're sweating a lot or if you're in excess heat. Your body is sweating to try to cool your body down. But when you sweat, most of sweat, 90% of it is water. So that's why you need to drink a lot if you're sweating a lot, because your body is getting rid of a lot of water. Yeah, so sweating could lead to dehydration because your body is losing water via sweat. So burns, a burn is injury to a tissue caused by heat, cold, friction, chemicals, electricity, or radiation. Burns are classified according to their depth. A partial thickness burn is classified as a 1st or 2nd degree burn, and a full thickness burn is a 3rd degree burn. So partial thickness kind of goes just kind of into the epidermis, into the dermis, whereas a 3rd degree burn goes all the way down through the integument skin layers. So a 1st degree burn, this is a superficial burn. It involves only the epidermis and it's red, painful. There might be slight edema, and edema just means swelling, which could be present. They can be caused by sunburn or brief exposure to very hot or very cold objects, and they'll heal usually without scarring in about a week. Yep, a sunburn would be an example of a 1st degree burn. 2nd degree burn, also partial thickness burn. And when I say partial thickness, that means partially kind of burning down through the dermal layers. This is 2nd degree because it can damage both the epidermis and the dermis, which is below it. If dermal damage is minimal, symptoms might include redness, pain, edema, blisters. Healing takes about 2 weeks, no scarring. If the burn goes deeper into the dermis, the wound could appear red, tan, white, and can take several months to heal and could scar. 3rd degree then are considered full thickness because they will completely damage the epidermis and the dermis layers. The region of 3rd degree burn is usually painless, and that's because all the sensory receptors in the epidermis and dermis have been destroyed. So if you come across someone who's been burned, and I'm sure it'll still be painful because not everywhere will have burned off all the sensory receptors, but in areas of 3rd degree burn, there will be no pain because all the sensory receptors will have been destroyed because it's gotten through those epidermis and dermis layers where the sensory receptors are located. These burns can appear white, tan, brown, black, or deep cherry red. Burn healing then, in all 2nd degree burns, the epidermis, including the stratum basale, which is the basement layer, is damaged. The epidermis will regenerate from epithelial tissue and hair follicles and sweat glands, as well as from the edges of the wound. Deep, partial thickness and full thickness burns take a much longer time to heal, and they can form scar tissue with a disfiguring or debilitating wound contractures. A treatment of burn to prevent a complication of a deep, partial thickness or a full thickness burn and to speed healing, sometimes skin grafts are often performed. And this is called a split skin graft procedure. The epidermis and a part of the dermis are actually removed from another part of the body to be placed over the burn. When it's not possible or practical to move skin from one part of the body to a burn site, physicians, plastic surgeons will sometimes use artificial skin or grafts from a human cadaver even. So here's a look at what burns are and how the thickness is related to the layer of the skin that they're affecting. So 1st degree gets through the epidermis, 2nd degree might get through the dermis. So those are partial thickness burns, and a full thickness burn would get through completely the epidermis and dermis to the subcutaneous layer. Skin cancer is the most common cancer. Please wear sunscreen every day. Even if you're not going outside, just buy a lotion with sunscreen in it and put that on your face, especially every day. Skin cancer causes death. It's mainly caused by UV light exposure, which we get a lot, or you guys get a lot in Southern California. Fair-skinned people are more prone. It's prevented by limiting sun exposure and using sunscreens. There's different types of UV rays. UVA rays cause the tan and are associated with malignant melanoma. UVB rays will cause sunburns, and sunscreen should be able to block both types. Types of skin cancer then, we have basal cell carcinoma, where the cells in the stratum basale are affected. So that's where the basal name comes from. This cancer can be removed by surgery. Squamous cell carcinoma is where cells above the stratum basale are affected. This is the type that can cause death because it can spread very quickly. Malignant melanoma will arise from melanocytes in the mole. So take a look at, I think maybe once a month, you should look your body over and make sure your freckles and your moles aren't changing shape or looking kind of strange, because any kind of change in shape or structure or color of a mole could be cause for concern. It could be a malignant melanoma. It's rare, but it could cause death, and you could always get the mole removed if it kind of is starting to look strange, or you could get it tested for cancer too. So here are cancers of the skin. I just got a direct message from someone. We get some patients in our ER that have allowed the skin cancer on their head too. It spreads so bad, it spreads to their brain, and you might get a hole in your head. Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. I won't say who shared it. It was a direct message to me, but someone works in the emergency room, and they've seen some patients allowing the skin cancer to spread to their brain, and then they get a hole in their brain. So skin cancer is not something to be taken lightly. This is kind of a look at what the different types of skin cancer can look like. I think it just goes in order: basal cell carcinoma, squamous, and then malignant melanoma. And you can kind of see, this is where dermatologists are really crucial for kind of picking these out, but you can kind of be your own doctor here. Is once a month, just take a look at your body. Especially in the face, if you even start to see a darker skin patch start to develop, just go to a dermatologist, get it checked out. They could remove it or test it to see if it is cancerous. But please wear sunscreen, wear a hat. You'll also get less wrinkles when you're older too. So aging and the integument. So again, we're going through the body systems, and kind of the last slide to keep us all thinking about our death. We talk about the aging of all these body systems, which oftentimes isn't the most positive, but it's very interesting to see how every body system ages. So how does our integument system age? Well, blood flow decreases, and this causes your skin to become thinner due to decreased amounts of collagen. So this very thin skin, what causes the elderly, if they get cut, it's harder for blood clotting to kind of keep that cut from bleeding out. So the elderly might bleed a lot more when they get cut, just due to decreased amounts of collagen. Decreased activity of sebaceous and sweat glands make temperature regulation more difficult. So the elderly might be cooler, they might have very dry skin, and loss of elastic fibers can cause skin to sag and wrinkle. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.